Kurt's point. It's fascinating.
See you.
going to call to order this meeting of the San Bernardino County Advisory Redistricting Commission today, Thursday, August 26th, 2021. This morning, we would greatly like to welcome Pastor Joe McTarsney, chaplain for the Montclair Police Department, who will lead us in the invocation. Pastor McTarsney is a county resident living in the city of Chino with his wife and his 2 teenage children. He served as a youth pastor at Calvary Chapel, Chino Valley for 21 years, and in 2016, he founded Calvary Montclair and serves as its senior pastor. He has been a chaplain for the Montclair Police Department since 2019 and has previously served as chaplain for the Chino Valley Fire Department. Pastor McTarsney was awarded the Global War on Terrorism Medal for his service at the San Bernardino shooting at Inland Regional Center in 2015. Pastor?
Please join me in prayer. Our Father, we thank you that you are faithful to hear and receive our prayers this day. I praise you, Father, for the leadership of our county and our city, who are still carefully and wisely navigating us as a community through these uncharted territories that we have never faced before. Continue, Lord, to grant each one of them calmness, courage, and rest as they are working longer hours as they carry the concerns of others on their hearts. I pray that you protect each one of them and also their family members. And Lord, I pray over this meeting before us that you will grant our leaders wisdom as it pertains to redistricting. Guide them along as they ensure that the lines will be drawn out properly so our leaders will be able to serve and represent the same amount of community members. We pray this in the name of Christ Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor. We greatly appreciate you joining us this morning. We would also like to welcome today Mayor Pro-Tem Bill Rue from the city of Montclair, who's going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Mayor Pro-Tem Rue is a lifetime resident of Montclair. He was first elected to the City Council in 1998 after serving on the Planning Commission for 10 years. He has also worked for the California Senate and the California Assembly, as well as the U.S. House of Representatives. Professionally, Mr. Rue works in the real estate industry as an analyst and governmental affairs manager, and he is a fierce advocate for affordable housing. Mayor Pro Tem Rue, thank you. We appreciate you joining us this morning.
You're welcome. Please put your hand over your heart and join me as we salute the flag of our great nation. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. We appreciate you joining us this morning. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, we will take roll call of the commission, and to that I turn to Madam Secretary, Ms. Monell.
Thank you, Judge Davis. Judge Davis?
Present.
Vice Chair King? Present. Judge King?
Present.
Commissioner Crefeld?
Present.
Commissioner Little?
Present.
Commissioner Basley?
Present.
Commissioner Jernigan?
Present.
Commissioner Anderson? Present. Commissioner Shannon? Commissioner Reynolds? Present. Commissioner Hazlett? Commissioner Wilson? Thank you, Judge Davis. We have a quorum.
Madam Secretary, thank you so much. At this time, we have before us the matter of approval of the August 19th, 2021 Commission meeting minutes. I am prepared to take any public comment on this item. Madam Secretary, do we have any requests for public comment at this time?
I received a call. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That being the situation, then let me ask, everyone has received and I'm sure reviewed the minutes from the last meeting. Do I have a motion to so approve those minutes?
Mr. Chairman,
Since I was absent the last time, I'll be abstaining in this one.
Basley, thank you very much.
So moved.
We have a motion, I believe, from Commissioner Little,
A second.
and a second from Commissioner Creffield. All those in favor of approval of the minutes from the last meeting on August 19th, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion carries to approve those August 19th, 2021 meeting minutes. At this time, I believe now we have the great pleasure of having a presentation presented to us by Ms. Julie Serber from County Counsel's Office. Ms. Serber?
Judge King, I don't have anything to report today, but we will be having a presentation by Chris Skinnell, who is a partner at Nielsen Mercimer, and he will be the next item on the agenda for us.
Wonderful. Ms. Serber, thank you very much. At this time, then, we will have a presentation on the Voting Rights Act and Fair Maps Act from Mr. Chris Skinnell, partner at Nielsen Mercimer, Baranello, Gross, and Leone. And if I mispronounced any of those names, counsel, I apologize in advance.
No, actually, it's pretty impressive. You usually get something wrong, and that was perfect, so I appreciate it. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about one of my favorite topics, it's being law, but redistricting law. Something that we do a lot of work on. A little bit about my firm and me, just briefly. Nielsen Mercimer is one of the leading political and government law firms in the state of California, and one of our specialties for the past 40 years has been redistricting and voting rights law. That means everything from counseling public entities on the redrawing of lines, as you're doing, to jurisdictions who are moving from at-large voting to districts. We've done a lot of that work recently, and even litigation. And so since just 2010, we've probably represented somewhere in the ballpark of 200, 225 jurisdictions on these topics. So, as I said, I'm happy to be here with you. We'll be talking about some big changes that have come down the pipeline in the last 10 years. The law in this area is getting more and more complicated, unfortunately. So, just to start with the very basics, why are we doing this? And the short, kind of glib answer is because the state legislature tells us to. It's in the elections code. The slightly less glib, more substantive answer is they've adopted those statutes in response to U.S. Supreme Court case law going back to the 1960s, which says that any jurisdiction using district-based elections has to review those districts periodically. Since then they've clarified periodically means at least every 10 years, to confirm that the districts are roughly equal in population so that everybody's vote has approximately equal weight voting for their legislators. This comes out of case law from back in the first half of the last century, where you had jurisdictions where one legislator would represent maybe a few hundred people and others would represent tens of thousands. The court said that disparity is unconstitutional, and so these statutes are designed to implement that rebalancing every 10 years. So what I'm going to cover in broad brush before we dig into it. First of all, federal law requirements for redistricting. Federal law really doesn't have a lot to say about redistricting in some respects. It sets basically outer boundaries. The equal population requirement that I just spoke about, and then basically it governs the use of race and ethnicity in redistricting and voting rights. And so the Voting Rights Act and the restrictions that the Supreme Court has articulated on racial gerrymandering. But as I said, those are outer boundaries. Within those outer boundaries, really the meat of the drawing of the lines is governed by state law. Now, historically, up until this cycle, counties had a ton of discretion in what they chose to take into account, how they chose to weigh the various criteria, what they decided not to take into account. And courts were very deferential to the decisions that jurisdictions made, so long as there was a rational basis for it. That's all changed this go-around with the Fair Maps Act. Now the Fair Maps Act, it was adopted just a couple years ago. It specifies a certain list of mandatory criteria that have to be taken into account, and it provides the order in which they have to be taken into account. So it provides a ranked priority. They're similar, but not quite identical to the criteria that were adopted back in 2008 for the State Commission, which drew the congressional and state legislative lines 10 years ago. But so that was sort of the basis. There are some minor tweaks, but that's where they come from. And then we'll talk about some of the other criteria that traditionally the courts and jurisdictions had considered and deemed to be legitimate, and where they still fit in relative to the MAPS Act. So starting with population equality, I know you've talked about some of this obviously in your prior meetings, but this is the number one overarching consideration above everything else. As I said, it's based on the U.S. Constitution and Supreme Court case law. And the way it works is, congressional districts have to be almost perfectly equal in population, the courts have said, based on the language of a provision of the Constitution that applies specifically to them. But the court has said for local and state legislative districts, there's a little bit more play in the joints. They have to be substantially equal in population, and there can be some variation as long as it's for the purpose of serving any sort of valid governmental interest, with the caveat that those interests have to be consistently applied throughout the process. And the way the court has articulated this, they've said any total deviation, and I'll talk very briefly about what that means in a second, any total deviation that is under 10% is presumptively constitutional. And any plaintiff that wants to challenge a plan that's under 10% has a pretty heavy burden of trying to challenge it. It doesn't mean it can never be challenged. It has been. I note here the Larios case from 20 years ago. In that case, the Georgia State Legislature adopted a plan that was 9.98%, so just under that threshold mark. But the court struck it down because it concluded that the reason for those large deviations was to favor Democrats over Republicans. So it was not sort of consistently applying a neutral criterion to protect incumbents. It was favoring one party's incumbents. And also because it was favoring rural over urban interests, which the courts have said is not really a legitimate purpose. So long story short, it is possible to challenge a plan that's under 10%. It's very, very difficult, though. It's very unusual. So how do we figure the total population, that total deviation? I want to say there are some numbers here on the screen. Don't pay any attention to the numbers themselves because they're just hypothetical. They're not San Bernardino specific numbers. But the way this works is you take the total population of your jurisdiction and you divide it by the number of seats. So in our hypothetical here and in the county, 5 seats. And that gives you an ideal population, which is the number there in the yellow. And then you take the smallest district's population and you subtract it from the largest district's population to get a number that you then divide by that ideal. And that gives you the percentage of deviation. And so in this case, the total difference between the largest and smallest districts is about 4,000 people. And based on the ideal population of 83,000 people, the total planned deviation in this example is about 5%. So well within that permissible threshold. So how did that apply to San Bernardino? These are numbers that were shared with you, I know, last week from Redistricting Insights, your redistricting consultants, demographers. Bottom line is actually pretty similar to our hypothetical, just about 5% total deviation of the current plan. District 1 is about 2.5% overpopulated. District 2 is about a little more than 2% underpopulated. That's our total difference there. And out of an ideal population of about 436,000 people, we get a 4.8% deviation. Now, I should note that those numbers are preliminary in a couple respects. They are based on the Census Bureau data that were released on August 12th, what are known as the PL94-171 data that the Census Bureau publishes for all states throughout the country. As part of or in connection with the MAPS Act, the state of California, the legislature, has adopted some required modifications to those data for the drawing of state and local district lines. The courts have held that the use of those PL94-171 data, if you use them presumptively, at least for constitutional purposes, that's legitimate and it's permissible. And there was a Supreme Court case just a few years ago that reached that conclusion. But It's also said that states can make adjustments to the data and use other modified versions of it, so long as it's systematically applied and non-discriminatory. In the case that this goes back to 1966, the state of Hawaii adopted a plan that was based on registered voters instead of total population, because they felt that including the large military presence that was very transient didn't make a lot of sense. And the court said that that was legitimate, that was okay. It did say, with the caveat that, ultimately the result wasn't all that different from what would have happened if they'd used the census anyway. So it's a little bit squishy, but the bottom line, the courts have recognized that some variation from the actual census data are legitimate. And what the California legislature has done is it's said that in California, incarcerated persons are only to be counted in specified circumstances. Now, previously, before the Fair Maps Act was enacted, counties could include prisoners, they could exclude them, it was within their discretion. And the practice was sort of all over the map. Usually they'd be excluded in a jurisdiction where the prison population was a significant part, like a city that had a prison in it. If you're a large jurisdiction like San Bernardino, maybe you didn't worry about it because it wasn't as much of an issue. But it was ultimately a matter of discretion. That's not the case anymore. What the Elections Code says is that an incarcerated person shall not be counted as part of the county's population, except for an incarcerated person whose last known place of address can be assigned back to a census block, so that we know, based on where they lived before they were incarcerated, where they were. That means that the population over at Chino is going to be excluded. Now, those prisoners may be redistributed. Some of them may end up in San Bernardino, some of them may end up in other counties and other places. And it also means that there may be prisoners from other prisons throughout the state that are reassigned to San Bernardino. The impact is primarily on the side of removing the prisons, right? That's a big chunk of population that just goes away. The redistribution, I would expect you're probably talking about a few people here and there. We found out today, this morning actually, from the statewide database that is processing these data, that they anticipate that there are about 96,000 prisoners throughout the entire state of California that will be redistributed. In a state of 40 million people, that's probably not very much in any given spot. But taking out the prisons will have a potentially significant impact, a few thousand people. Also this morning, we learned a little bit more about how the statewide database anticipates treating federal prisoners. There was a little bit of ambiguity both in the statute itself and in their prior guidance on how they anticipated doing that. What they said this morning is they're going to just zero them out. They're not going to try to reassign anybody. Those prisoners will just not be a part of the population base at all. That's about 12,000 prisoners statewide, so not necessarily a huge number, but there are the federal prison facilities up at Victorville. Those will be zeroed out as part of this process as well. So long story short, I gave you some numbers, that 4.8%. That's subject to change. I don't think probably huge change. We're not talking about massive numbers in the grand scheme of San Bernardino's population of over 2 million people, but there could be a little bit of variation. It could affect things a little bit on the margins. In terms of the timing, the state adjusted database, the Census Bureau data put out their data in mid-August. The California statewide database said that they need 5 to 6 weeks, so we are currently anticipating sometime mid to late September. That still seems to be the current timeline for them. We're kind of hoping that it's after September 16th, because if they do it before that, the county has to wait 3 weeks before it can start looking at maps, before its consultant can even publish any maps. If we get to September 17th, and therefore we're within 60 days of the final deadline for adoption, that cooling off period, if you will, shortens to 1 week. So we'd actually probably be a little bit better off with a little bit of extra delay at that point. So within the, obviously overarching consideration of population equality, the next two most important considerations are the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the restrictions on racial gerrymandering. The Voting Rights Act is a statute, federal law is supreme, so it prevails over any state criteria. And the restrictions on racial gerrymandering are based on the U.S. Constitution, so they're also pretty supreme over any state considerations. And as we'll talk about here, These two, they both relate to how race and ethnicity are used in the drawing of district lines, and there's a tension between them, which I'll explain, and it's been getting more tense over the last each decade. And so there's kind of a fine line, a needle to thread in applying these in some cases. But Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act prohibits any electoral system, not just districts, but including districts, that would dilute racial or language minority voting rights by denying minority voters an equal opportunity to nominate and elect candidates of their choice. So it's the standard racial groups identified by the Census Bureau, Black, Indian, Asian, other, and even white in appropriate jurisdictions. And then they've also included language minorities. So anybody who speaks any of these identified languages, the key one in California, in most places, is Spanish. That's how the Latino population becomes covered by this act. And, excuse me, the way this works is the Federal Voting Rights Act may require the drawing of specific shape of district for a minority ethnic group if certain criteria are met. It's not just you can do it so you have to. But the Supreme Court has articulated 3 primary criteria for deciding whether that is necessary. First, the minority group has to be large enough that it can form a majority, so at least 50% plus 1, within a single member district. And it's a majority of the citizen voting age population. So not the total population like we consider in the population equality calculus, but the citizen voting age population. So basically the eligible voters, because we're focused on whether you can vote and prevail in elections. The second consideration is whether that minority group votes cohesively, whether they have common interests, and as reflected in past voting patterns that suggest that they view themselves as a cohesive group. And then third, whether the majority, the non-minority group, typically votes sufficiently as a block to enable it to defeat the minority's preferred candidate. So if the minority voting block generally wins, there's not a Voting Rights Act issue there. It's only if they consistently lose and they're cohesive and they just get outvoted on a consistent basis. Not one election, not probably 2, but a consistent basis over time. And then if all 3 of those criteria are met, the standard is that you then focus on sort of the broader context and whether that group is really being shut out of the process for purposes of that, and that's for purposes primarily of litigation. For purposes of districting, if you can meet those first 3 criteria, you can kind of guess that you're probably going to have a Voting Rights Act concern that you need to address. And the courts have said, if you meet those 3, it's not a slam dunk that you have a Voting Rights Act issue to address, but you're 90% of the way there. So the focus is really on those 3. There are 2 basic ways in redistricting that the Voting Rights Act is violated. They're essentially, the opposite sides of the same coin. The first is packing. So you've got enough voters that they can be essentially a majority within a given district, or within a number of districts, but you so heavily push them into a single district that it effectively pulls them out of all the other districts that they could have influence in or effect in. And that's known as packing, because you've packed them all into as few districts as possible to minimize their influence. And then the reverse of that is cracking, where you draw the lines in such a way that those minority populations are divided amongst so many districts that even though with properly drawn lines you could potentially have, they could control districts, they're so divided that that's not the case anymore because they're not actually a majority. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but here's a little bit of an example of a cracking case compared to the left side is kind of standard, straight up, your result if you have an even number of 2 groups, and then the right side is how you can draw the lines in such a way that you disadvantage the blue group in this case by cracking them. Historically, in the Voting Rights Act context, we've seen primarily cracking claims. That's generally been the type of lawsuits that have been brought in the redistricting context. Over the past decade, though, there's been more and more packing claims that have started to arise. And it relates to the restrictions on racial gerrymandering that I'll talk about in a minute. As I said, this only really becomes an issue if you can draw that district that has at least 50% plus one of the population. The Supreme Court has said if you can't do that, then the Voting Rights Act doesn't require anything. That doesn't mean you can't necessarily draw a district that takes that racial group into account, but you're not required to by law. And so, as I said, then the next related piece of this is the restriction on racial gerrymandering. And there is a tension because the Federal Voting Rights Act obviously requires that jurisdictions take race and ethnicity into account in redistricting. But the 14th Amendment, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, restricts the circumstances in which you can do that. What they basically said is race can be taken into account, even if the Voting Rights Act doesn't require it, as long as it's just one consideration in the mix. Because it recognizes that legislators and staff, they're going to know the racial makeup of the jurisdiction naturally. That's, and it's part of political coalitions and everything else. But the problem arises under the 14th Amendment when race becomes the predominant criterion in the drawing of district lines. To the extent that all of the other traditional criteria are essentially subordinated to that drawing of that district. In that case, when it's deemed to be the predominant consideration, the Supreme Court says you need to pass what's known as strict scrutiny, which means it needs to be, you need to have a compelling state interest for doing it that way. And you need to do it as little as you can to meet that interest. And a couple of cases here cited that talk about that, but there's a whole line of them. So first question, is race the predominant consideration? How do you know? The early cases that decided these issues found it based on the shape of the districts. This is the original racial gerrymander from the Shaw versus Reno case in 1993. It's District 12 out of North Carolina, Congressional District 12. And it basically started down in Charlotte and meandered its way up through the state, 160 miles up to Durham, just shooting off little offshoots to pick up every pocket of African-American population up that freeway that it could. And that was it. That was the entire rationale behind the drawing of this district. In defense of North Carolina, they felt like they had to do it because the Department of Justice was telling them to, U.S. Department of Justice, based on their reading at the time of the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court said, yeah, your reading of it is not correct. You don't need to go to this extreme, to the point where you completely disregard all of the traditional criteria, and in fact, this shape here is unconstitutional. A caution though, even though the early cases were based on these sort of bug splatter looking districts, you don't have to have that to have a racial gerrymander. There can be other evidence that race was the predominant consideration, and if there is that other type of evidence, that would also meet the test and trigger then that next inquiry on strict scrutiny.
We seem to have lost the presentation. They're working on resolving that issue now.
All right. I think at this time, ladies and gentlemen, what we'll do is try and give our technology people about 3 minutes to see if we can restore things. I'm just very glad to say I didn't touch anything. I assure everyone I had nothing to do with any of this, which makes me frankly feel very good to be able to say that. One thing I will do while we're waiting is take the time to welcome and thank for joining us today one of the Montclair City Council members. I believe we have Councilmember Denise Johnson here with us this morning. Councilmember, thank you for taking time out of your busy day to be here with us. We're grateful to have you with us this morning. All right, I see things on my screen, Mr. Skinner.
Yes.
Are we able to continue?
It looks like it. So
Wonderful. You may
back to it.
proceed, please.
All right. So just to finish up this slide, as I said, it doesn't have to be a crazy shape for race to be the predominant consideration. You know, if there's evidence or in the record that there were explicit racial targets that were adopted by the jurisdiction, or any sort of other evidence, comments by the adopting body, et cetera, that can also be used to show that race was the predominant consideration. So, you know, how do you address this tension between the Voting Rights Act and the restrictions on racial gerrymandering? Assuming that you have evidence that race was the predominant consideration, the Supreme Court has assumed, and the lower courts have generally held, that complying with the Voting Rights Act is a compelling state interest. And so that's the first prong of the analysis. Now, you got to be a little bit careful because that gets you past that threshold. You still then have to worry about, are you doing more than you need to do? Is it still narrowly tailored to meet the Voting Rights Act requirement? But at least that gets you over the first hurdle. And the court has said that a jurisdiction that has good reason to believe that the VRA requires a particular district can meet the first part of the test. So that doesn't mean that you have to prove that it absolutely was positively required by the Voting Rights Act, that if you went to court, the court would definitely hold that that was the case. But if it's a good argument, then you know, you have a little bit of discretion to make that determination. Because the court has recognized that it's putting jurisdictions and redistricting bodies in a tough spot, forcing them to kind of you know, walk through the two competing interests. And so it's allowed for a little bit of breathing room, but it still has to be narrowly tailored. And it's also necessary that the jurisdiction have engaged in a good faith analysis of whether the Voting Rights Act really applies. Because it can't just sort of say, hey, we can draw 50% districts, therefore we're going to do it, and leave it at that. It has to have done something more. You know, historically, those sorts of rules of thumb were acceptable, but within the last decade, the Supreme Court case law has developed that there has to be more than that. In fact, it may be necessary in some jurisdictions to do what's known as a racially polarized voting analysis, which is a statistical analysis of whether those groups really are cohesive and whether they really are routinely outvoted. You know, not every case requires that, but some occasionally do, if you're really going to contend that the Voting Rights Act required a particular shape of district. A little bit of practical advice in addressing these two criteria is, to the extent you can avoid it at all, don't focus solely on race. As I said, it can be taken into consideration, but also focus on the traditional redistricting criteria like communities of interest, more broadly defined, compactness of the districts, you know, all of the other traditional considerations that go into districting, so that you don't run into the issue of whether it's predominant or not. Now, in some cases, it's unavoidable, but you know, that's the best approach if it's at all possible. Again, very preliminary demographics suggest that districts 4 and 5 are currently majority Latino citizen voting age population districts. District 4 just barely. District 5 has something of a cushion. And you know, we'll see how that plays out, because obviously these districts are going to have to change for the population balance potentially, and based on the community of interest testimonies. So those are the two primarily that we'll be looking at through this process as part of this. One other sort of note, I mentioned the totality of circumstances. One thing that the Supreme Court has said is that when the number of effective opportunity districts is roughly proportional to that group's population in the jurisdiction, that's a factor that weighs in favor of not finding a Voting Rights Act violation. And so you see here there's 2 majority Latino districts. That's roughly proportional to the population in the county that is Latino citizen voting age population. So another factor in the mix. So that's federal law, and I said it's broad outer boundaries, still pretty complicated, but that's, you know, sort of the overarching framework. And then within that, we're going to talk about the Fair Maps Act, state law that really governs the sort of nitty-gritty of the process. As I said, this is very different now from what it was 10 years ago and prior, where jurisdictions had a ton of discretion in how they draw their lines and what they would take into account and how they would do that. The legislature has now specified 5 mandatory criteria, and it's provided that they have to be considered in this specific order. First, contiguity. Second, minimizing the division of neighborhoods and communities of interest. Third, minimizing the division of cities and census-designated places. Fourth, focusing on easily identifiable natural and artificial boundaries. And last but not least, the compactness of the population within the districts. And we've sort of clarified that it's not the compactness of the district, it's the compactness of the population within the district. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. First, contiguity. This is actually, not generally the most complicated piece of this. The legislature, in adopting this requirement, provided a definition, but it's not really much of one. It just says, be contiguous, and then it says what that doesn't mean. It says no point contiguity. So that means you can't have districts that only touch at a single point, which isn't very typical, but 30 years ago there were a couple of congressional districts that did that, so it's not unprecedented. And it said that when you have water dividing 2 parts of a district, it's not going to be regarded as contiguous unless there's a bridge or a tunnel or regular ferry service between them. Now, the obvious exception to the contiguity requirement are islands. They have to be attached somewhere. So usually you just treat them as contiguous to the nearest district. But otherwise, this generally isn't a huge problem in counties. It's mostly an issue in cities that have very irregular boundaries, like this example here, where there's this inlet, and the 2 sides of the railroad tracks are separated by county, unincorporated county territory. But that's the contiguity requirement, the most important. And then the next most important is preventing the division of communities of interest in neighborhoods. And considering communities of interest has always been permissible, it's always been sort of traditional, but now this elevates it to the primary consideration after contiguity. You have an example here of why this was adopted. In the 2001 redistricting, this is Watts, and you can see how it was treated in the congressional districts. The hash was completely made out of it. So it's divided amongst 3 different districts. Who do you go to? Who's your congressperson that you address? Maybe hard to say. And then in the 2011 redistricting, when this community of interest requirement was incorporated into the Constitution, you see Watts was unified here. And so now they have a very clear idea of where their congressional district is. So, communities of interest, talk about communities of interest, it's a very non-intuitive term. What exactly does it mean? State law definition of a community of interest is a population that shares common social or economic interests that should be included within a single district for purposes of its effective, fair representation. Now, how do you apply that? First of all, it's got to have a common social or economic interest. We'll talk a little bit about what that might mean. I think it has to have some connection to county policy. If someone comes in and says, hey, we want this state to put a park in a certain location, that's fantastic. That's good and well. The county isn't going to be deciding that. That's going to be a state issue. So it may be a community of interest for state redistricting purposes, but it may not be one necessarily for county redistricting purposes, because it's not an interest that relates to county's scope of power. It has to be geographically described. If it's too diffuse or too broad or too generally mixed in with the regular population, it may be a community of interest in a general sense, but how are you going to unify it within a single district? It has to be something that you could define geographically and to know where it is. And then it has to be a community that benefits from being in a single district. And that isn't always necessarily the case. And there may be testimony that people come in and say, no, we don't think we should be kept together for our representation. We'd like to be divided. We see this sometimes with homeowners associations who would rather have 2 representatives that they can talk to instead of 1. The bias of the Fair Maps Act is going to be keeping those communities of interest together, but if there is strong testimony that that community doesn't want to be unified, then it may not be one that should be included within a single district for purposes of its effective and fair representation. The one other caveat in the Fair Maps Act is it specifically specifies that it is not a community of interest based on relationships with political parties, incumbent legislators, or political candidates. Now, obviously these are nonpartisan offices, so the party considerations are generally not significant. But the easiest way to comply with this is generally to keep political data out of your database. Next, the common social and economic interests. What does that mean? It could be just about anything. It's very subjective and jurisdiction specific. What is a community of interest in one place might not be in another place because that's not how people think of themselves. But it could be any number of broad things, based on the lifestyle of that group, community character, recreation, economic issues, certainly, common employers, for example, major industries in the area. Maybe it's all focused around a business improvement district. It could be anything. Demographics, potentially, renters versus homeowners, immigration status. I have race here. It's got an asterisk, and the reason it does is because, as we talked about, considering race needs to be done very carefully. But it might be a factor in the consideration of a community of interest. Geographic issues, maybe you're in a more rural area versus suburban or urban. Political subdivisions, that other than the cities and CDPs that we're going to talk about, so maybe school districts, community service districts, planning areas, et cetera. Or any sort of, place-based issues, wildfire, et cetera. It can be very specific. As I have mentioned already, homeowners associations might be a community of interest. People who want a specific dog park might be a community of interest. One of my favorite examples, 10 years ago, some folks in the city of Phoenix, downtown, they all owned these red brick homes, these historic homes. And they came in and said, we care about how you treat our homes for planning purposes. We think that we have a common interest in that. We want to be kept together in a district. And the council kept them together. So that, long story short, that gives you a sense of how broad and how sort of general this concept could be. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but this is another example. These are some examples taken from the testimony 10 years ago before the State Commission of communities of interest that could be taken into account. And again, it's going to depend on the testimony that we receive. One sort of caveat I'd give you is, and already sort of addressed, is just because it's a community of interest for state purposes doesn't mean it necessarily is for local purposes. Because the state is 40 million people, communities of interest may be very general and large. Whereas once you get down to the local level, they may be more specific and concrete. So, it may be different, but the state testimony may be pertinent in some cases. As I said, the Fair Maps Act, historically, once you'd identify communities of interest, then there would be discretion on how you treat them. Do you divide them? Do you not? As I said before, the Fair Maps Act, it has a preference. It says, you keep them together. Now, we'll talk a little bit about some of the caveats, and obviously, as I said, if people come in and say, we don't think we should be kept together for representation purposes, that might be appropriate, but you got to have some strong testimony to that effect, because as I said, the bias is in favor of unification. So, how do you keep identify these communities of interest? You can use demographic data, you can use official planning maps, that sort of thing. The online mapping tools, which your consultants will have available, but far and away the most valuable way, because it is so subjective and because it's so specific to the jurisdiction, is testimony from the community. And also, you have, you're members of the community as well. You have personal knowledge of these communities, so you will have insight as well. But what you're looking for is for people to come in and say, this is my community. This, this is the common interest we share. This is where we're located. So that you have that concrete location, and why is it that you should be kept together or separated, and so we're really looking for the public to give us that feedback. Related to communities of interest at the same level of importance is minimizing the division of neighborhoods. Is that really significantly different from communities of interest? Probably not. It might be a little bit more sort of concrete from a planning perspective. But again, the community testimony is going to be the most important piece of this, and how we identify those neighborhoods. So underneath contiguity and communities of interest neighborhoods, then we focus on minimizing the division of cities and census-designated places. Fortunately, this is a little bit more concrete. We know what they are because the Census Bureau puts out mapping files that tell us where all of those census places are. Cities, pretty self-explanatory. A census-designated place is a settled concentration of population that's identifiable by name but not legally incorporated. Unincorporated areas, but that everybody kind of knows where they are. And I've got some a map here that shows some cities within San Bernardino County and also some communities of interest. Those are the gray areas there. As I said, it's fortunate these are at least a little bit less ambiguous in terms of where they are. And then, fourth in line, natural and artificial barriers. Obviously pretty straightforward. Natural and man-made boundaries that just kind of make sense. People know where they are. So freeways, railroad tracks, mountain ranges, things that people can look at and say that my district goes to there, and so that they understand where their voting districts are. And this has always been a consideration. Now the legislature has codified it, but it just makes sense in terms of the understandability, if you will, of the districts for people to understand who their representatives are and where they vote. And last but not least, compactness. As I said, it's the lowest priority. As with all of these, none of them are an absolute mandate. All of them say to the extent practicable, in recognition of the fact that some higher criterion may require you to then violate the lower ones, or it just may not be possible. The equal population may not allow it. But to the extent you can, you are to focus on the compactness of the population. And what that means is you don't bypass nearer population to go get further away population. So even if the district looks pretty, it might be a perfect square, if it's got population in one corner and the other corner here, and then there's other population just outside, that might not be compact within the definition of this act. I have an example here. You see District 7 kind of meandering past population in the green and purple districts, goes over and picks up some territory on the other side of the 5 freeway. That is probably not compact, but it comes with the caveat that if that is necessary to unify a defined community of interest or comply with the Voting Rights Act, it still may be an appropriate configuration because those criteria are more important. But it is not compact within the definition of the Fair Maps Act. We've been going a while. We're getting close, I promise. I'm going to just finish up here with the role of other traditional criteria in the districting process. Historically, the courts and districting bodies have recognized a number of other traditional considerations that are not in the Fair Maps Act. A big one is focusing on keeping the cores of existing districts intact, starting with sort of the current lines and minimizing changes, understanding that when you do change district boundaries, it often results in people being switched from one election cycle to another, voters, which means that some people may vote twice in a row, other people may skip an election and not get to vote for as much as 6 years. And the courts have recognized that that's just how it goes. It's inevitable. There's no way around that. But they've also recognized traditionally that it's a legitimate consideration to try and minimize that impact if possible. They've also recognized that it's a legitimate consideration to avoid head-to-head contests between incumbents. Now, I know San Bernardino's adopted a one-term limit, so maybe that's less of an issue anyway. But the courts have said that that is a legitimate consideration. It's different from drawing districts to favor re-election necessarily. It's just so they don't have to run against each other. One traditional consideration is anticipating future growth. Again, that needs to be done on a completely systematic basis across the county. It can't be haphazard. Given the timing that we're facing in this process and the delay of the census, that's going to be really, really, really hard to do. I wouldn't recommend doing that. And then also other political subdivisions besides the cities and CDPs, are keeping those together. How does that all fit in? You can't take those considerations into account in a way that would require you to violate the mandatory criteria in the Fair Maps Act. But in some cases, you may, for example, have to split a city or a CDP. I picked out here San Bernardino. It's a huge city. It's almost certainly going to have to be divided somehow, right? It's just how it is because of its size. And so those traditional criteria where they still fit in the mix is they might give you a way of deciding how you split San Bernardino, for example. Do you split it east-west? Do you split it north-south along a different freeway, for example? So you're not violating the Fair Maps Act because you're already doing something. You already have to split them anyway. But those traditional criteria might help you to decide, what that split looks like. So with that, I've been going a while. I'm happy to answer questions.
Mr. Scannell, thank you for your presentation. Let me inquire of my colleagues on the commission if any of them have any comments or any questions at all for Mr. Scannell.
Not here.
We're a silent group for you this morning, council.
Sounds good. That means I've done my job, hopefully.
Let me ask, Madam Secretary, do we have any public requests to speak at all?
No, Judge, I've received no requests.
Very well.
Judge Davis?
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question.
Judge King, I apologize. You
Well,
may
I was slow in
inquire.
coming up. You mentioned the September 16th date relative to the numbers, the incarcerated, and the impact of when you receive those new numbers on when it is that maps can be drawn. Who is, whether there's a 3-week period or a 1-week period, who is it that's precluded from drawing maps till that time? Anybody? Or
Any official body. So this commission can't do it. Its consultants can't produce maps. The public, though, can. So you'll have the online mapping tools available, or paper maps or whatever. Members of the public can start drawing maps now if they like and submit them as suggestions. But this commission and the county and its staff and consultants cannot publish draft maps until that time period has elapsed.
cannot publish.
Right.
Can they be working on them?
Presumably, they will be behind the scenes starting to put them together during that period.
Such that even a commissioner could get assistance on working with the program that for drawing maps with somebody from the county, and that would not be prohibited.
Correct. I believe the actual language is shall not publish in the code. So you don't want draft maps out there like right away that the public hasn't really had time to focus on and react to. Obviously, that it's a working period for those. If you're going to be able to publish on that 21st day, for example, or the 7th, you got to be working on it up to that point.
Thank you.
Judge King, thank you. Any further questions or comments at all from any of my colleagues on the commission?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on some of those answers. So there can be discussions during our planned meetings on, obviously a proposed map isn't potentially an official map, but
Right.
there can be steps to start the process and discussions before that. September.
Yeah, I mean, I think conceptual discussions of what you might be wanting to consider, yes, are appropriate. I think identifying the communities of interest that you will be taking into account is appropriate to help guide the demographer, the consultant. What you can't have is an actual map. But you're not supposed to just sit in silence and cover your ears and pretend nothing's happening for 3 weeks. Yeah, you can be having sort of general conversations about the direction that you're going and what those maps might look like, to give feedback to that consultant so that they can come back to you once those 3 weeks are up and have something for you to actually consider and look at.
The reason I ask that is because we've been told that community participation is, fairly minimal until there's something that begins to take shape. And, I'm trying to flush out that community interest. Just thinking in my mind, do we begin discussions of, we're looking along these lines or something to try to pull those, the community in before we actually start some official process.
Yeah.
I think that's okay.
Yeah, to your point, I think in drafting the Fair Maps Act, it would have been helpful if they had focused more on the aftermath period, because that really, I agree, is really when people start to focus. But yeah, I do think that sort of general and conceptual discussions of what you're thinking about is appropriate to get that sort of feedback. So, I mean, just as an example, not a proposal, we want to move Victorville from one district to another, in sort of general terms. And you're not deciding, which districts necessarily or where the lines are going to fall, but sort of in that general sense, you start talking about that as a possibility and see how people react to that. I think that's permissible. I think that's legitimate. And what you don't want is a map that you then hold up and say, like this, this is what I mean. That I think is where you start to have a problem.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Masby, thank you very much. I want to inquire of the commission alternate members if they have any questions at all or any comments with respect to Mr. Scannell's presentation. Mr. Reynolds,
I've got three.
please.
First one is
Excuse me, I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds, if we can ask you to come up to the mic so that we can capture what you're saying. Thank you.
My first question is, what would create legal involvement with this process? Where would you step into this? What would constitute that?
So we'll be working with the demographic consultant to review all of the maps to make sure that, obviously they'll make sure that they're equally population balanced. That's not too difficult. But then we'll be working with them to address any Voting Rights Act issues. That's usually the big one. And then, in this circumstance, depending on what the testimony looks like, the commission and then ultimately the board may have to decide, how do you treat communities of interest? You may have conflicting testimony. You may have to decide, somewhere something has to be split, deciding how to do that. So, the Voting Rights Act is probably the big piece of it, but trying to apply all of these criteria and make sure that you're not violating any of them, because they're now mandatory, opens more doors for that, potentially.
In your answer, you answered my second question, which was, would you be involved in the review process? So you answered that. My last question is, what could institute a revision of the work once it's completed?
I imagine you're referring to well, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
So once the mapping's been completed,
Mhm.
if there was something that would arise that would constitute a trigger or revision, what would that be?
Mr. Scannell, could you restate Mr. Reynolds' point or comment to you? Because I'm not sure that everybody here had an opportunity to hear him. Unlike me, he's very soft-spoken.
He said, once the mapping has gone a ways along the process, what might happen that would constitute or trigger a revision? And I think the long and short of it is it's sort of an iterative process. So at any point along the way, there may be a revision to the map. Because what you'll get, typically, the way this works, is the consultants will bring in 3 maps, for example, and say, based on all the testimony and the feedback we've gotten from you and from the public, we think these 3 maps might be ways that you would go about doing this. And then you'll have people say, I hate map A, I think it's awful. I like map B, C could work, but maybe needs to be tweaked a little bit. And then they'll go back to their, layer, cave, whatever, tinker around with them, bring back some modified versions, some revised versions. And then they'll get more feedback. And it sort of goes on that process until the end when the board, they've got their deadline, they've got to pick one at that point. But any time up until that process, either based on legal requirements or just based on the interests of the public and the board, they can order changes to the lines throughout the process.
Thank you.
Commissioner Reynolds, thank you very much. Ms. Hazlett, Commissioner Hazlett, any questions at all or any comments for Mr. Scannell?
No, sir, not right now.
Very well. Commissioner Anderson, same question. Any comments or questions for our presenter today?
Not at this time.
Wonderful. Mr.
And I
Scannell.
have one more question.
Judge King, I'm gonna have to get you sitting closer to me.
So you can control me better, huh? I have a question. In terms of the community of interest that was referenced pertaining to Crestline to Big Bear and the 2011 State Commission
Oh, yes.
procedures, if the basis for them finding it to be a community of interest in that context if that basis is applicable to our considerations, are we compelled in any way by them having previously made that finding?
No, I don't think so, because communities of interest can change over time. So, what was a close-knit community might not be anymore. It's really going to depend on the testimony that you receive in this process. I mean, presumably, if they're going to the state commission to say that that's a community of interest, they'll want to provide that, same information to you as well. But, they may not. And so it's really going to be incumbent on you to consider what's presented to you and provided. I will say in that context, the CDP census designated place city consideration may warrant at least keeping those two separate communities unified. Now, not necessarily with each other, necessarily. If people come in and they provide testimony saying do that, then that might be a community of interest to be taken into account. But a finding 10 years ago doesn't necessarily require it this time.
Judge King, thank you very much. Now, out of an abundance of caution, let me ask one final time if any of my colleagues have any further questions or comments for Mr. Scannell. And I'm looking at you, Judge King, with great interest. Hearing no further comments or questions, Mr. Scannell, again, we thank you so much for your presentation today. We appreciate all the information that you provided to us here this morning. We're very grateful.
It's my pleasure. Thank you again for having me.
Of course, thank you. All right, at this time, I think I should indicate that we're grateful to have Ms. Pamela Williams with us, who is available to receive any direction from the commission regarding any topics that the commission would like to have discussed at any future commission meetings. And with that, I'll inquire of my colleagues if in fact they would like to offer some proposed direction for Ms. Williams along those lines.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if there's anyone that has any requests for topics they'd like to discuss at the next future meetings, it's all yours. You have the floor.
Okay. Look down at this end. I'll look down at Judge King's end of the.
I had something I want to say, but not on that issue.
Are you sure you wouldn't like to ask Ms. Williams anything? Ms. Williams, I think that for today's purposes at least, the commission members have no comments or requests or questions for you. But again, I have overlooked the alternates. And here I am, Ms. Hazlett.
I won't let you overlook us. So I just want to have some direction from the team. I've been playing with the maps. It's the 210 data that is there. Looking at the packet that we got last week, and then the revised packets that you sent out, when you run the numbers, there's still a gap in numbers. So all those charts, they added Apple Valley to it.
You're referring to the city charts?
Yeah, so you got two sets of charts that went out. You have the district maps as they currently set with that population.
With the 2020 data.
Yes.
Yes, correct.
And then you've got the blue chart,
The city breakdown.
the city breakdown. When you run the numbers, those two don't match. So where is the balance of, they're not in the CD, or the CDPs, they're not in the city data. Where's that gap of about 21,000 people?
That could be in the unincorporated areas that were not listed on the maps, or not listed in the charts. I have reached out to the consultant earlier this week. I gave him about 7 major unincorporated areas that were not listed there. They are not here today to respond to your question, but I will absolutely get a response and send that out to the full commission later today. But that could be, I don't know that that's the answer, but that potentially could be where those.
That's what I was assuming was the issue. So here's 2 follow-up questions.
Okay.
One, when is the 2020 data going to be put into the mapping tool? So that, as the attorney said, we can start to play with those, not publish
It is
them.
there currently, it has been uploaded.
As of yesterday?
I'll verify, but
Thank you.
I have been told it was updated.
And then, do we have authorization to reach out to the consultants independently, or do we have to wait for this process?
Absolutely, you can reach out to them.
And that's
And
all I
I
need.
will give you their contact
Thank
information
you.
to the entire commission later today,
And thank you, sir.
if you don't mind.
Commissioner Hazlett, thank you again for reminding me how important it is to inquire of all our members. I appreciate that reminder. Let me ask Commissioner Anderson, any further comments or questions at all from Ms. Williams? Wonderful. Commissioner Reynolds, let me ask, any questions or comments from Ms. Williams? Mr. Reynolds, thank you very much.
Judge, can I ask a clarification on that of Ms. Williams? So the discrepancy that Commissioner Hazlett asked about and you responded to is that there's some people who aren't in any municipality or any CDP, at least that we have on the chart. Like, you know, we have Baker, which has very few people, but we don't have Zizek's Road.
Mhm.
I'm trying to think of a place that isn't on this list. And then there seem to be about 20,000 people who
Correct.
are out in the country, shall we say.
Mhm.
I can't remember if you
So
have.
Newberry Springs, Yermo, Hellendale, that's just the ones I can immediately recall.
Yeah.
And I'm getting a message from the consultant, yes, that there are rural areas that are not included in that list, so we will get those added. as soon
Well,
as possible.
that's all right. I just wanted to clarify what the answer was. I mean, some may be too small to chart, but, well, I don't know. I say that, but Blue Water has 116 people, so maybe nothing's too small to include.
We noticed that as well. Blue Water and Big River are not the largest unincorporated areas, as you know, in the county. And so for those to be on the list and not some of the larger ones, we did identify that as an area we needed to add to that list. So we'll
Well,
be sure to add that out.
Well, I
Add that
appreciate
to
the respect you've given to people who are living, in our county and are valuable members of the county and aren't aggregated close to that many neighbors to be listed so far. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman? Thank you.
Yes.
I'm not sure if this falls under commissioner comments or provide direction to staff, but I do like to look ahead, the next meeting or the meeting after and what direction we're going. What are the planned presentations to help the commission begin the steps into formulating maps? I'm trying to figure out do we have some kind of workshop together that we start discussing amongst ourselves in public, obviously, or is it, do we ask the consultant, do you have some proposed maps? I'm trying to figure out what the initial steps are
So-
and what staff is planning to present to us along those lines.
Sure. So we are going to continue with just inviting community of interest groups to provide testimony if they're available on our meeting dates. But really, we are looking, this item is on the agenda for you guys to make a recommendation to us. If you would like to set up a workshop to work amongst the commission and bring in the consultant and have him draw maps, during the meeting, we are open to do that.
I'm just trying to formulate exactly how that would work and open to suggestions, but it sounds like we've run out of the presentations along the legal lines or the numbers lines, and now we need to start rolling up our sleeves and I'm trying to figure out what direction we would give to you to help us start that process.
If you would like to direct staff to ask the consultants to come back at the next meeting to take, take your direction and draw maps during the next meeting, we can do that.
I just wanted to say, I think that would be a good idea, because that follows up to kind of what Judge King was asking earlier, in that not all of us may be, with the ArcGIS savvy.
Sure.
So even just some tutorial type of situations that we can kind of take home and play with, I think that would help a lot of us feel more comfortable with the mapping.
Excuse me, Commissioner, if I'd just like to clarify, we can't at this time actually draw maps because of the deadline that was talked about, that we're not allowed to, the commission is not allowed to release maps to the public, and that would include drawing them in a public meeting. You can certainly have the consultant come in and provide additional training on how the mapping tool works. You could provide direction to the consultant along the lines of when we release a map, we'd like to see these communities of interest considered, or other factors that are on the list that Mr. Skinnell went over. But for the next couple of meetings, we can't actually draw maps until that final database is released by the state, and we know that timeline.
And Ms. Server, is my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that data we expect to have released by the middle of September at the latest, we hope.
Middle or end of September. It's the state.
Fingers and toes crossed for the middle of September, understanding it might be the end of the month.
Well, it actually would be almost preferable if they wait till September 17th, because that cuts the waiting time down 1 week. If they release it September 15th, we're forced to wait the 3 weeks under the elections count.
All by way of saying that perhaps once that data actually has been released, to the extent the commission is as interested as a number of the members have expressed in having some significant discussion with our consultants in terms of using the map drawing tools, making sure that we're able to start getting numbers actually that are current and reliable for purposes of those discussions. I think it would be a really good idea to make sure that we have the consultants available at that point, because I imagine there's going to be a great deal of question and answer from the commission to the consultants with respect to the map tools at that point in time.
And maybe something along the line of having the consultant address options on initial steps to formulate maps. In other words, what other jurisdictions have done to get to that first step? I mean, right now I'm trying to figure out how, us as a commission, do we all come individually as with maps? Do we wait for the public and then to submit the maps? I'd like to know the different options, how to get to that first step of, starting someplace with some options.
Sure,
If you
that makes sense.
understand, okay.
Do we make a motion on that?
This just be direction to staff as far as a future topic.
Perfect. Consultant to provide option steps to formulate maps going forward.
It'd be helpful if we do a motion in a second.
I'll be glad to make that motion then, that we ask staff to make sure that we'll provide direction to staff to make sure we have the consultant available to discuss those issues with regard to mapping. And I think I'll leave it very broadly worded because I expect there are going to be a good deal of questions involving a number of topics pertaining to mapping. But with that being said, and probably unartfully so on my part, I'll make that motion.
I'll second that motion.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor of approving the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No? That motion carries. Ms. Williams, as always, we thank you, and I'll ask, Madam Secretary, I have once again
It popped in.
forgotten my alternates. Mr.
It came
Anderson.
up in a casual conversation in my community not too long back. Best way to explain it is Native Americans and how they are put in reservations. Are they included within the county in these mapping figures, or are they kept separate? It's kind of hard for us because different things mean different things. The one tribe in my community is actually split on one side in Arizona, one side in California. They work by Arizona time because that's where the main office is. So what I'm trying to get at, where are these figures? Are they in this paperwork, or is this something that's been left out?
Might that be something perhaps that Ms. Williams can inquire of our consultants about, so that at the next meeting, which is, I believe, in Rialto on September 2nd,
Correct.
that information ought to be,
I just, even if they're even in those census figures, because it just seems that a little low. And I've got a feeling that maybe this was done governmentally differently, because it's a reservation.
Mr. Anderson, I appreciate the comments and the suggestion. And I think we already have, from Ms. Williams, some indication that the consultants are going to be providing updated numbers in response to Commissioner Little's comments earlier. So we can just tack those on to
I
that.
appreciate it, thank you.
Well, you're most welcome. Commissioner Hazlett, any further questions or comments for Ms. Williams? Commissioner Reynolds, any further questions or comments? No, all right, and thank you again, all of you, for the reminder that I need to look up a little bit more to see that all of you are still here. All right, Ms. Williams, thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you.
And I think I did inquire if we had any public comments or questions for
You did and we do not.
Madam Secretary. Thank you, I appreciate that very much. At this time, I'll call for any general public comments. We don't have too many people here, but I'm not seeing Madam Secretary come over to me with a list. We have no public comments? All right. So since we have no general public comments, let me ask if, before we deal with adjournment of today's hearing, do any of my colleagues on the commission, including our 3 wonderful alternate commission members who have been patiently here with us all morning, do any of my colleagues have any further comments or questions before we adjourn? Mr. Gerrymandering?
No, not at this time.
Mr. Creffield?
Not at this time, thank you.
Mr. Basley?
And not at this time, thank you.
Ms. Nicklin?
Not this time.
Mr. Little?
No, thank you, Judge.
Judge King?
Yes. I have not been as successful as you have been in terms of working with the MAP program. I'm ready to work on it further, but who could I contact to get some one-on-one assistance?
That would be Fabian Valdez, and I will give you his contact information with Redistricting Insights. He's available to you to assist you with that. And I did just find out that Commissioner Hazlett is correct. The 2010 census data is still in Maptitude, and they are working to get that uploaded, the 2020 census data added to the mapping tool currently.
Ms. Williams, thank you. Judge King, any further questions or comments?
When is it that they anticipate that they will have it in the tool?
I can follow up with them later today and ask them, but I believe sometime later this week. But we will have to wait until the prison population will have to also be reduced later. So would the commission like to wait until the prison population is deducted from that data before it is uploaded into the tool? Do you have a preference?
My thought would be this. Whenever the data is uploaded, I think we would all like it to be the most current and the correct data.
Yeah.
So I think it makes some sense if we need to wait until that prisoner population data has actually been provided to do that. Judge King, that would be my thought.
We can still provide you with the training in the meantime, just the data will be different.
But the rest of the data will be in there. It's only the prison stuff that will not correct. And right now, we don't have the rest of the data. It seems to me we're going to lose some valuable time in working with the program if we don't get started on our own interviewing material.
Well, if it's possible to get perhaps the most current data, leaving aside the prisoner population data uploaded, if that's the request, I don't see any reason why the consultants couldn't get that done, so long as there is a caveat with the data that is uploaded indicating there is still more data that's going to be released mid or late September. And at that time, that will constitute all of the most current and correct data for purposes of that program.
Understood, we can do
Okay.
that. Mhm.
Judge King, anything further for Ms. Williams?
No, thank you very much.
Judge, if I may,
Of course.
thank you, sir. what I'm hearing from a few of these sessions we've had with both demography and now legal counsel is that the prisoner population is really pretty minuscule. A good portion go out into other counties, and the rest may be somewhat evenly distributed. That unless we're at the example that Mr. Scannell gave of a place where they were at 9.98, you know, it seems like we can move forward without that, and it's going to, at least on the equality side of the priorities, have so little impact that I don't see that as something that we need to wait on, in my opinion.
Commissioner Little, thank you very much. Any further comments at all?
I agree with him.
Okay.
The numbers, if he said 12,000 statewide, that's pretty minimal.
Commissioner Jernigan, thank you. Any further comments? Now, as I was going to say, and Commissioner Hazlett, if I've been mispronouncing your name, I apologize. Oh, you're very welcome. Any further comments or questions for Ms. Williams? Commissioner Reynolds, any further comments or questions for Ms. Williams? Mr. Anderson, your last go around. Commissioner, any further questions for Ms. Williams? All right. All that being said, I think the business of the commission today is taken care of. At this time, I am going to order that the meeting be adjourned. Our next scheduled meeting, which I think I mentioned previously, will be Thursday, September 2nd. This will be our first evening meeting in the Rialto City Council chambers in the city of Rialto. That'll start at 6 p.m. So we invite any and all of you who may be interested to join us on that occasion. But the meeting stands adjourned. Thank you, everybody.